Welcome, everyone, to this Good Leadership Podcast. My name is Charles Good, your host and the president of the Institute for Management Studies. This podcast is designed to provide you with actionable insights and tools that you can use from discussing the research, stories, and background from recognized experts and practitioners to accelerate your impact in your current role. My goal is what we've discussed today will be immediately actionable and useful to you, and I'd love to hear your comments for this episode about what you're planning on implementing. Today, I'm very glad to be joined by Dr. Jackson Nickerson. Jackson, welcome to the program.
Thank you very much for having me, Charles.
Love to hear a little bit about your history and background and really what got you interested in leadership development and helping others.
Well, thank you very much. In a prior life, I was a NASA engineer back at the Jet Propulsion Laboratory, but a lot has happened since then. I've been a professor for the past 25 years, and one of my keen interests is organizations, how to lead them and how to change them.
Wonderful. Well, today I wanted to go through one of your topics that you cover for IMS, also a book that you have released on leading from the middle, because we find a lot of our listeners are managers in the middle rungs of an organization, and they're finding it difficult to lead and to make change from their position. And you give some facts in your book and in your program that I thought really were eye-opening, and I'm sure they're a little bit dated, but I bet you anything they're probably just equally applicable today as they were back then. And some of them are 75% of the change efforts fail to achieve results on average. You also list 70% of change initiatives that are critical to success fail. And 70 to 90% of the time, organizations fail to implement strategic plans. So failure, at least for performance, is the norm. Do you still see this as the case? Is it worse than it's ever been, or are these trends improving?
Sadly, some data is timeless, and this data is part of that. If you look back pretty much every decade, you'll find that change is rather difficult. And it depends, the numbers depend on what you're changing, but by and large, failure is the norm between 60 and 90% of the time when you're talking about strategic and vital changes you're trying to initiate and plan in an organization.
Well, that's what I figured, and I was hoping maybe for a better answer from you, but I understand. So that's why we're talking about it today, to help leaders really deal with this more effectively. Now, there is a difference in leading change if you're from the top or if you're from the bottom. And you state that if you're leading change from the top, you focus on three things. Could you let our listeners know what they are and unpack those a little bit?
Sure. In fact, most approaches to leading change assume you're at the top, that you have a lot of resources, you have a lot of decision rights. And that works out well if you're going to fundamentally change the strategy for the entire organization. And I mean fundamentally change. It works out well if you're going to try to institute a cultural change. Those are environments where it can work really well. If you're going to restructure the entire organization where you're getting rid of parts of it and maybe bringing in through acquisition other organizations, then this works well. But the reality is it doesn't work well often for a very important reason. These methods were all developed decades ago, where you had something called closed strategy, where the people at the top of the organization get together, figured out what to do, and then told everybody else what to do. That's no longer the case. Strategy is a much more open issue, and there haven't been that many change methodologies designed for this new era of open strategy.
Thank you for providing that. You mentioned mission, strategy, and culture are really those driving forces for change if you're from the top, but there's a different tool set or different things you should focus on if you're leading change from the bottom, correct?
Oh, indeed. And people are quite familiar with these approaches. There are things like Six Sigma, Lean Six Sigma, TQM. And all these methods are about breaking an organization down into small activities and looking at those activities in terms of an input and output. And so when something isn't going well, it's about making the activity tighter, better, able to deliver a higher quality. But what you're doing is tightening down an entire system. You're making an entire system more tightly interconnected, which on the one hand is great if you're trying to drive quality up and cost down. On the other hand, if later you need a strategic change, you've actually made it much more difficult to change the entire organization. So some good things and some bad things about leading change from the bottom.
But it sounds like it's essential, though, for a change initiative to happen from the top if leading from the change at the bottom has been done correctly and over time has progressed as it should.
Well,
Or
you think that's the case, but really what you need is leading change from the middle. And that's why we're here talking today.
there you go. So you mentioned also different models for change, and you mentioned four different models: the Beer's six-step model, Cantor's 10 commandments, Cotter's eight-stage process, and Mueck's seven steps. Is there one of those that's more common or easy to implement for organizations that you prefer?
Well, you know what's interesting is all of these come from a guy named Kurt Lewin, who in 1947 said you had to unfreeze, then change and refreeze organizations. And most of the change models that we even use today date back to that simple statement and simple expression. Now, all these change models can be useful, can be good in particular contexts. But in general, they're not good for this leading change from the middle. If you're talking about Cotter, which is the most popular one, he developed that by studying CEOs. So if you're going to make that mission change, that culture change, the strategy change, it's not a bad process to use. But if you're going to try to involve lots of people, it's not a very good process. It's not a very good process when you have to engage those people on the bottom. The other two methodologies you mentioned had to do much more with changing teams or leading change within a team, which is very useful, very functional. But if you have lots of teams and you have to make these changes across the organization, then those methodologies don't work too well either.
And that leads us to leading at the crossroads of change for the middle level manager. And you give three steps. And I think this really simplifies it, but provides essential steps that they need to look forward to take in order to make change happen from their position somewhere in the middle part of the organization. And the first one is categorizing stakeholders. Could you go into a little more detail about that and what stakeholders they should be identifying?
Certainly. First of all, a stakeholder analysis won't sound new or novel to most people. The question is, how do you do it? And in my worldview, there are actually four different stakeholders, four different categories of stakeholders. And for each category, our change initiative is going to look differently. How we engage them will be different. The strategies, the communications, the tactics, and the sequencing will be different based on the category. So what I recommend is to identify four categories. The first is superordinates. Those are the people who are in your direct chain of command above you. The second is to look at the subordinates. These are the people who are on the direct chain of command below you. The next category is towards the side of you. These are your clients and customers, whether they're inside the firm or outside the firm. And the final category are those folks who could be complementers. They have resources or decision rights you'd like to access, but they could also be blockers. People who could say no or impose a lot of costs and are not in your superordinate or subordinate chain and are not your clients or customers. Once we identify those four different categories of stakeholders, then it opens up a whole range of strategies, tactics, and communications, and the sequencing of those things that will differ for each one.
That's great. Let's try to go through each one and just identify that strategy because I love the wording you use. For the superordinates, your bosses, you say
Yeah.
you need to get agree in for that group, correct?
Yes, that's right. Yeah, so a green is a label for a group of different things. Now, you want to deal with your superordinate chain first, and you want to deal with your most immediate manager first. Now, sometimes you may say, hey, boss, I want to lead a change effort. But more often than not, if the boss is coming to you to say, I need you to lead a change effort. And the idea of agreeing is a way to engage in a series of questions that will gain support of your superordinate, especially when you deal with some rough spots in leading change. It'll also help you understand what your boss needs from you so they are never embarrassed. And that's sort of a key thing most people don't talk about. How do I make sure my boss never gets embarrassed? Another thing we focus on is how do I help the boss make a credible commitment to intervene when I need support? And how can I assure that I am maintaining and even building trust with my superordinate. Now, this matters in particular if they're relatively new. So to do that, we offer 5 different groups of questions. Now, the questions will differ in your specific instance, but there is a key insight, which is this. I like to use the metaphor of a veggie burger. Now, the veggie burger has a bun. I like to put a lettuce on the bottom. Then the veggie burger itself, a big beefsteak tomato, and a bun on top. Now, why do I use this metaphor? Here's the key insight. Anything that's going to be difficult and potentially create a threat response, you want to make the meat of the conversation, or in this case, the veggie burger. It should be in the middle. Don't lead with the tough stuff, and don't end with the tough stuff. Make the beginning and the end of the conversation somewhat easier issues and questions to deal with. Save the most difficult part for the middle. And what we do in the program is go over the different layers of conversation and give very specific questions about what you should be asking and how to go from the easy stuff to the tough stuff back to the easy stuff again. That's what we mean by agreeing.
I love that metaphor. And really, it's all designed around how can you gain your boss's support and build and maintain trust with them. Now, the next one is the subordinates. Those are the ones below you. And you use the phrase be in.
Be in. First, let me explain why I use the term be in. All too often in organizations, people use the term buy-in. Hey, do I have your buy-in? And most people, when they ask for buy-in, think it means, oh, I'm asking you to get on the bandwagon, join the team, be on the bus, commit to what we're doing. And they think they're engaging people, involving them, including them. But here's the reality. When someone says buy-in, here's what the other person is thinking. Well, let me get this straight. I wasn't in the meeting where you decided what to do. I'm the cog in the wheel, and you want me to turn your way so you can be successful. Did I get that right? Now, surely not everyone thinks that, but it's surprising how often they do think that. So be in is a different approach. It's a way to select the right people in the team. It's a way to get their commitment to the process. It's a way to communicate a preliminary vision, but it's very important that the vision is very preliminary, very open. Because if it's open, then people can participate in developing psychological ownership in terms of what the change initiative is all about. But if you provide all the details and all the description of exactly what you want, you've just squished out their opportunity to have any psychological ownership. And so instead of being included, now either you have to be directive and you need those decision rights, or they're going to push back because they're not going to have any ownership. Being is a way to overcome those impediments.
Thank you for that unpacking of that. That's great. Let's move then now to where buy-in fits in, and that's with the customer. Customers have to be willing to pay to use it, right? And engage. You should be engaging with lead users, getting their opinions, inviting customers to be a part of the be-in process as well.
Yeah, so I just told you a moment ago, never use the term buy-in, and here I am using the term buy-in. But the reality is, when you lead a change, you're creating new capabilities, and someone is going to be using those capabilities, either within your organization or without. A customer is going to buy something. For them to buy, they're spending with their time and their treasure. So how do you make what you're offering valuable enough so they'll buy it? Now, here's a basic insight. If the cost in terms of time and treasure is outweighed by the value, people tend to buy. If the value is 3 times their cost, they almost always buy. So this ratio of 3 to 1, even though it may not be precisely quantified, the concept of it is rather important. And what we do in buy-in is go through 4 different strategies for how you can discover what their issues are so you can design enough value and have them perceive that the value is far in excess of their cost for adopting. So buy-in goes over these 4 different strategies, which you can use one, you can use the other, you can use all of them together. That's the purpose of buy-in.
Is there one strategy out of those 4 that's more commonly used?
A great question. The short answer is no. It may depend on the specific stakeholder in question. So it simply depends on your context. And more often than not, it's not one more than the other. It's often combos. You want to use combinations of these four strategies. And a lot of very successful leaders end up using all four strategies.
Thank you for that answer. Let's move to the final group of stakeholders, those complementers or blockers. And for this group, you state the term allow-in, where you need to gain commitment from the complementers, convert blockers to complementers, and then diminish the potential for blockers to undermine the success of the change initiative.
Yeah, you've already given my key punchline. That's what we're trying to do. Make sure people are going to support you who say they want to support you. There are opportunities to help people transition from a potential blocker to an actual complementer. And in very extreme circumstances, maybe you can't get that blocker on board, and we give a few strategies on how to deal with that. Now, unlike the last category, which was buy-in, here we have 5 different strategies. Now, these strategies are sequential. In other words, try the first one. If that doesn't work, try the second one. If that doesn't work, try the third one, so forth and so on. Now you can see why it's so important to understand up front what the different stakeholder categories are and to get people in the right stakeholder category, because you're going to be interacting with them in a potentially different way in order to gain their commitment, their psychological commitment and support.
How do you differentiate complementers and blockers from the other groups? Is there
Yeah,
a distinguishing characteristic with those? Because they could be within the organization, possibly external to the company.
right. In fact, you're exactly right. They could be inside and outside also. Here's the key thing to think about. First of all, start with identifying your superordinates, then your subordinates. Those two should be easy. Then try to identify who the customers are. And here we want to be specific about who the people are. Then those people who don't fit into the prior 3 categories that either have the potential to support you or could harm the change initiative, they fall into the categories of complementers and blockers. And usually it's pretty obvious which ones they are. They'll say they want to help and support. They have the resources that you need. On the flip side, there'll be others who typically say no. Now, this is not to disparage anyone, but often it's folks like procurement. Well, we can't do that. Or legal. That's not the way it's done. Often it's these functional areas. But that's not entirely true, and there can be other people inside and outside the organization. For example, if you're in a public setting, the media should always be considered. And often you shouldn't consider them as complementers. You should consider them as potential blockers. And that's going to affect how you engage them, how you treat them, what strategies you use.
Thank you. So we've identified those and categorized those stakeholders. We've given some strategies for each one. That's really kind of the first step. And then we kind of combine the second step of your 3-step process and matching communication strategies, tactics, and sequencing costs to each stakeholder. The third and final step is really avoiding stimulating negative emotions. You have a great acronym, DEF. If you could unpack that for us, because I think that's going to really benefit our listeners, because this is something that I think is always an issue with change, especially in those middle ranks.
Well, first, let me take a step back and define deaf. The dictionary has 2 definitions for deaf. One is a physiological condition where we can't hear, but the other one is a choice not to listen. And so hopefully, obviously, the acronym DEF is this choice not to listen. And this is one of the unique aspects of this particular approach to leading change. When people feel disrespect, envy, anger, often from jealousy, or they feel fear, that's the DEAF, disrespect, envy, anger, and fear. When they experience those emotions, they've been triggered. It's a trigger response. And those emotions tend to be rather durable around issues of leading change. So when people feel this way, they will go out of their way to stop you, to harm the change process. Now, the good news is everything we've talked about up until now is designed to mitigate and avoid the potential of these emotions being sparked. But nonetheless, they can be sparked. And so what we review is how you can not only prevent these emotions, but then try to overcome them and to help people back away from these emotions so that you can continue with your change initiative.
It'd be great to just understand a little bit more regarding where they're coming from. So if you have someone that's resistant to change, what are questions you can ask or ways to identify really what they're feeling from this change, and then possibly strategies to help them get through that?
Yeah, so let me talk about the big picture and I'll give you a couple specifics.
Great.
The big picture is people resist because of fear. And that fear becomes problematic because people don't trust and they don't understand. So if they don't understand, they don't trust, you're going to get fear. And that fear can make them very sensitive. So they feel disrespected. They feel that jobs being taken away from them. That's jealousy and anger. They could be envious of you leading change and getting kudos for it, and them being on the receiving end and being upset. So a lot of what we're doing to prevent these emotions is to help people trust you and the process and understand what's going on. You see, trust and understanding can overcome that fear and prevent a lot of these negative emotions. There are other things too, but that's sort of the big picture is how you manage and engage this trust and understanding.
Is there one of these that's more common than others? You mentioned fear as kind of the underlying negative emotion when people think of change. But are there certain other emotions that come into play depending on the position or the title, the role of that individual?
Let me describe it this way. Almost anybody who's going to be impacted by change will have fear. And when there's fear, they won't listen to the rational explanation. They want strategies that'll mitigate their fear. And so they listen to the grapevine, which always passes false information. So that's sort of the broad emotion. But I think disrespect is a poignant emotion that happens very frequently. And it comes from people perceiving a dignity violation. They feel like their dignity has been violated. And so what we do is we provide a number of specific steps on how to avoid these sort of dignity violations. And what's challenging is that the notion of dignity can vary by individual. Religions have different definitions of it. Cultures see it a different way. And so that dignity violation is perceived because there's a disrespect, but those disrespectful actions might be very person specific. So in some ways, that disrespect is the most difficult one to deal with because it can be very person specific.
Thank you for providing that. And thank you for unpacking this three-step structure to manage to lead change from the middle, which you're going to go into a lot more detail during this program. But I know that our listeners on the call got a lot of value out of this. So thank you so much, Jackson, for joining me today and unpacking this model.
My pleasure. Thank you for having me here.
Let our listeners know if what's the best way to reach out to you to connect with you.
The easiest way to connect with me is my email address, which is nickerson@wustl.edu. That's Nickerson at wustl.edu. Thanks for asking.
And this has all of this stuff that we talked about in the program today is part of your book. It's Leading from the Middle. You can order on Amazon. Great book. A lot more detailed structure examples. So please check that out as well as you learn to lead better from the middle. This concludes this episode of the Good Leadership Podcast. If you like what you heard today, please share this with your colleagues and friends and anyone else that might find this valuable. If you'd like to subscribe, this podcast can be found both on Apple and Spotify, as well as accessed on the Institute for Management Studies website at ims-online.com. Until next time, remember, it's not what you know, but what you do consistently that makes a difference.